Hello, this is RICKY, the YouTube Tech Guy. Welcome to Why Upgrade. This is a very special episode because we have the next generation Ryzen 7000 series CPUs from AMD. Today we'll be telling you a lot of the new features found in the new AMD 7000 series, reasons you should upgrade, and finally, benchmarking and comparing the new AMD Ryzen 9 7950X, the Ryzen 7 7700X, and the Ryzen 5 7600X. So why should you upgrade? Well, we're dealing with a lot of new things with Zen 4. The AM5 socket is an LGA 1718 type, which is going to allow for much faster speeds because of these new pin connectors. This is a big change, and I'm excited to see if we really do get the boost that AMD is claiming. These CPUs are now also on a 5nm FinFET chipset, which means a lot smaller than last year's 7nm. This is really cool to see for me coming from the mobile world of tech, because a lot of the advancements in speed and efficiency have come from creating smaller chipsets. These chipsets and the new X670 motherboards are now supporting DDR5 RAM as well. Spoilers, while we've been testing behind the scenes, these CPUs love 6000 speed memory. Speaking of those specs, let me tell you about the build I have here today. We have the Asus X670 Extreme Hero motherboard, 32 gigs of G.Skill Trident Z 6000 speed DDR5 RAM, an ASRock Radeon RX 6950 XT, a Corsair iQ H150i AIO, all in the Thermaltake Core P3 open frame case. Now, first up, we have the Ryzen 9 7950X, so let's put it through Cinebench R23 and 3D Mark and compare it to the 5950X we tested a few weeks ago. Now, before we get started with the benchmarks, what has changed between the two builds? The CPU, motherboard, and RAM. Namely, the CPU, we went from the 5950X to the 7950X. For the motherboards, we went from an AM4 version to an AM5. And the RAM, we went from 32 gigs of DDR4 memory to 32 gigs of DDR5 memory. So without further ado, let's get started with the first Cinebench benchmark at single core tests. Alright, so that was our result for the single core benchmark, but before we get started on talking about it, let's go to the multi-core score as well, test it out, and then we'll talk about both of them comparing to the 5950X from before. Alright guys, the scores are in, and I am really surprised. Single core was already, I saw, impressive, but multi-core on a whole nother level. This is a really significant increase. So, single core, let's go over it. Single core on this one was 2042. The really impressive part about that is they really have stepped it up on single core, because the 5950X registered at 1625. So that's 400 bump up. That's really, really good. Like, we're talking about much better than scores we saw from AMD last year, and definitely more comparable on the top end for single core. But when it comes to multi-core, wow, guys, this is really, really good. Last year's 5950X was 24,964. This year's 7950X, 37,264. That is insane for a 1-year upgrade. That is definitely like a multi-generational jump up. And we are seeing it right here. To go up over 12,000 in 1 year, that is significant. That means that these CPUs are well worth it when it comes to processing power. Like, that is just really impressive. I cannot stress how much that's typical for a multi-year gap, not a 1-year gap. So I am really impressed by this. A lot of AMD's talk was showing what we can do now, and they're not lying. I'm really, really impressed by how good this score was. Let's go ahead and check out 3D Mark now and see how well it performs in the CPU profile. we're starting off. And we don't have the frames per second yet going, but let's see, the GPU fans are spinning. And there goes the CPU fans now as well. So it is ramping up. I swear from like 1 minute ago, the fans have kicked up now. So definitely seeing more fluidity as soon as the fans kick up, that you can just see it's moving more smoothly now. Really nice looking run there. I always thought this was such a cool concept. I don't know if any game has ever done this. You go to the past and you can grab the weapon from the past to use in the future. It's kind of cool. All right, now this is the CPU running. We do see it going between 70, 60, 50, ramping up as I hear the fans going. All right, so the CPU score is in for 3D Mark, and again, a significant increase. For the 5950X, we scored 11,633, and now the 7950 is scoring 15,220. That is a really good significant upgrade, almost by 400 points in just a year-over-year benchmark. I think that is really impressive to see from 1 year to another, it going up by that much in 3D Mark's CPU profile. So, should you upgrade from the Ryzen 5950X to the new 7950X? I would say yeah, guys. This is a really significant increase year over year that we see in CPU computing power. Like, I'm very impressed by it for 1 year's time that you get this much of an increase. So if you are looking for the top of the line, I think it's well worth it to jump from the Ryzen 9 from last year to the Ryzen 9 from this year. But what if you're looking for a Ryzen 7? How does it compare to the 5950X? Luckily, we can answer that. We're going to now test out the Ryzen 7 7700X. I'm honestly really curious to see if it can outperform the Ryzen 9 from last year in a few key areas. So let's go ahead and see just how it does. All right, now that we're finished with single core, let's jump into multi-core and then discuss the results. All right, guys, now we have the results for the Cinebench R23 benchmarks, and these are kind of impressive. So the Ryzen 7 7700X compared to last year's Ryzen 9 5950X is very competitive, actually. So first, the single core performance has completely changed in terms of this, because the Ryzen 7 from this year outclassed last year's Ryzen 9 5950X, coming in at 1986 compared to last year's Ryzen 9 coming in at 1625. That's over 300 difference for a single core score. So it's really impressive to have a single core score that high for a Ryzen 7, mind you. So that is showing you that year over year, all of these small changes really did make a big difference. Now, when we go to multi-core, well, that's when a whole different set of cores, right? The Ryzen 9 from last year is going to be at 16 cores. This year's Ryzen 7 7700 is at 8 cores. Nonetheless, though, still pulled out a 19,305 score compared to the multi-score of the Ryzen 9 from last year, pulling out 24,964. So again, for a higher tier up, this is actually really still impressive, definitely beating a lot of older processors and definitely ones at its same level. So that's really impressive to see that we're getting 8 cores that are getting closer and closer to 16 cores from last year. That's awesome to see and definitely really cool. Now let's go ahead and check out the 3D Mark scores and see how well they do there. Now again, for this one, we are going to be checking out the CPU profile. All the other hardware is the same again, but we are just going to be looking at the CPU profile and seeing how it does when compared to last year's 5950X, and see also how it does compared to this year's Ryzen 9 as well. All right, guys, 3D benchmark is in, and we have seen something very impressive here. The Ryzen 7 from this year, the 7700X, has now beat the Ryzen 9 from last year, 5950X, coming in at a score of 12,777 compared to last year's score for the Ryzen 9 coming in at 11,633. This is kind of impressive because it beat a much higher one with double cores from last year going to this year. So this is really cool, and I think it's really great for price points because we're always looking at what is competitive at the price point you're looking at. So overall, the Ryzen 7 7700X is really impressive. It is a tough choice between the Ryzen 9 5950X from last year, even with its discounts, because we are seeing a really competitive benchmarking. We are seeing that the single core is actually better on the Ryzen 7 from this year, and the multi-core kind of seems to be going back and forth. So very curious to see how it comes about in terms of which one you would buy right now. But let's go ahead and check out the entry-level Ryzen 5 7600X because I'm really curious to see what scores that one will put up now. Alright, so we have our single core score, but let's go on to multi-core and then let's talk about these results. Alright guys, so now we have our benchmark results for Cinebench R23 for both single core and multi-core. And the single core on this series really continues to impress. Again, this is entry-level Ryzen 5 7600X, and the single core scored 1,933 on the single core. That is really impressive, guys. Like I'm honestly really kind of surprised, and you could see just as it's stacked up. I mean, this is not too far off from the Ryzen 7 or the Ryzen 9, quite frankly. Like, the single core performance is really good here, and it's just very impressive that it's gotten that far ahead, even beating the Ryzen 9 5950X with the 1625 score. So really cool that we're seeing that kind of jump up. Now, in terms of the multi-core score, this is a 6-core processor with 12 threads, and it is still pretty good. It is coming in at 14,537, so really good. Again, comparing to the Ryzen 7 series from this year, that's 19,000, compared to the 5950X from last year, that's 24,000. So we're seeing a lot of these, again, really good performances for being a 6-core. To really go that far already is really nice, and it's a nice bump up from previous years. So very happy to see that overall in the Cinebench. But now let's move on to the 3D Mark test and see how the CPU does there. Now, as we see with the 3D Mark score, we're still getting some impressive scores here. 9,549. Again, this is the entry-level Ryzen 5 7600X from this year, but it's not too far off from the top of the line of last year, the Ryzen 9 5950X, which scored 11,600. Comparing to 9,500, that's only 2,000 away from top of the line last year to entry-level this year. I'm really happy with seeing how much improvement we've seen year over year, even at the entry level compared to the highest end. Alright guys, that concludes our episode. Let me know what you think in the comments sections down below from these results. Were they enough to make you want to get one of these new CPUs? And which CPU do you currently have in your computer now? And which one would you upgrade to? The Ryzen 9, 7, or Ryzen 5? Let me know in the comments section down below. These are pretty tempting, I have to say. I can't wait to see more from them. This has been RICKY, the YouTube Tech Guy.